sometimes the journalist or the journalists collectively should withhold the information, or at least withhold part of it. And other times they should release it, but it should be their decision. It shouldn't be the decision of the government or corporation or court. And let me give you a couple of examples of different ways it's been handled in democratic societies. WikiLeaks is an example of a huge amount of raw data, memos, reports from soldiers, financial records, some of them from US, but some from a Swiss bank, some from British companies. And a non-journalist organization, WikiLeaks, initially decided to release that material. And at least in the beginning, Julian Assange did some of that in cooperation with news media, Der Spiegel, the New York Times, the Guardian. And it was the news organizations that decided which of those documents should release, which ones should not be released, should parts of some of them be edited out with the names, for example, of CIA informants. It wasn't the organization that got the documents that made that decision. So journalists at news organizations used their own professional judgment, their editorial judgment. In the case of the New York Times, the newspaper went to the State Department and the Pentagon in advance, didn't show them the stories, but said, we have these documents, do you have a comment on them? And it gave an opportunity for the government to say, don't release this because of a possible intelligence leak, or it's going to disclose military strategy. Second situation, back when John F. Kennedy was president of the United States, the New York Times had information that the United States was helping Cuban exiles plan to invade Cuba in an effort to get rid of Fidel Castro, the communist leader of the country, and that the CIA was training these Cuban exiles, and that the United States planned an invasion at the Bay of Pigs. So the New York Times went to the president ahead of time and said, we have this story, do you have any comment? And the president said, no. The president did not go to court or attempt legally to block it. The New York Times, he did ask the Times, could you wait a few days so you would not jeopardize this operation? So the New York Times did wait a few days and then published the story. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster. Many of the exiles were captured and they were jailed in Cuba. And John F. Kennedy later said that he regretted asking the Times to delay the story, because if the Times had published the story as scheduled, the invasion would have been called off, and this major political and diplomatic defeat would have been avoided. So you can't always tell from the complaints and protests of the government whether there will be or will not be those kind of ramifications. And there are times when no matter how well the journalists attempt to limit what they're releasing, that there are bad consequences. And WikiLeaks is another example of that. There was a memo released that indicated that a BBC correspondent in Ethiopia, that a correspondent in Ethiopia had gone to a meeting that dealt with press freedom and human rights in Ethiopia, and the name of the correspondent was not taken out of the document when it was published. He then fled the country, and he told the BBC that had he stayed, because his name was in this document, he had done nothing wrong, but he was tied to the human rights movement, that he would have been imprisoned or worse. For journalists, there's always a difficult balance. What does the public have a right to know if it's public information and government information? Is it make a difference if it's private company information or government information? Does it affect the public? If the press doesn't report on it, then there may be consequences. If the government goes to court and prevents publication or prevents broadcast, then the government is intruding on constitutional rights of free expression.
There is a huge responsibility for the journalist who should decide whether to publish or not.
Exactly. Can I give you a new example from America? Because I've just been reading this in the last couple of days. In the state of Maine, the police arrested a woman who ran an exercise studio. She was arrested for prostitution. And the account was that she was having sex, the men were paying her, and she was videoing some of those. And that she also, or her partner also, had a record with the name of all of the customers. So she and her partner were arrested, and some of the men, through their lawyers, went to court because they did not want their names released in the police record, even though they had broken the law by paying a prostitute. And it was going to ruin their reputations, and there were probably well-known people in the community. So the local newspaper opposed that. The newspaper wanted the right to print the names as the newspaper would in any other case where somebody is accused of a crime. And a judge ruled this week that the police had to release the names. So the police department released only their names, but not their addresses and not their ages. So the newspaper, and I think other news organizations, posted the names of the men who supposedly had paid the prostitute. And one man who was a retired police officer had the same name as one of the people whose name was released. And because the police released only a name and not the address or the age, it looked like this former police officer was a customer of the prostitute, which he claims he wasn't. And he was interviewed on television and how this has damaged his reputation. So the government withheld some of the information, and it led to embarrassing at least one innocent person. Did the public have a right to know who may have broken the law? There are consequences all the time when that happens. When there are witnesses to a crime and they testify in court, does that mean that friends of the criminal can go after them later? It's tough to make those decisions, and it's up to journalists to be responsible and to consider what the consequences might be and what the benefits to the public might be. The woman and her partner who were arrested, they have not been found guilty yet either, but their names, their pictures, their court appearances all are public record. I think that's one of the risks you have in an open society, is that privacy has a high value, but it's not the government that decides what is kept private and what is not. You might argue the other way, that in this prostitution situation, the politicians or the high-level community leaders, the lawyers, the ministers, their names should be released, and the ordinary people's names should be kept secret, because nobody cares much if the owner of the grocery store or the bus driver is paying a prostitute. It's just as illegal one way or the other, but it's not going to have any public impact. It may have an impact on their families. First of all, I don't think any news is good news for everybody. That there are always going to be winners and losers in everything, and that journalists should recognize that. So people say, why isn't there more good news in the paper? Well, what is good news? Is good news that the euro is up or the euro is down? The gas prices are up or gas prices are down? If gas prices are down and you have a car, that's good. If you own a petrol station or you have shares in British Petroleum or Shell, then you want higher prices. Elections are another good example. You just had a parliamentary election. The news was good for some people, and the news was not so good for other people. Even disasters. And I use this example with my students in America, with the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Was that good news or bad news? And the students all say, oh, that was bad news, it was terrible news. 3,000 people died, billions of dollars in damage. All these ramifications increased military spending. It led to the war in Afghanistan. It led to the war, in some ways, it led to the war in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan, you might think, well, the September 11th attacks didn't have much to do with Lithuania, but you have military troops serving in Afghanistan. So who was it good news for? Well, it was good news for terrorists. It showed the United States was vulnerable. It was good news for companies that make police equipment and military arms. It was good news for law enforcement agencies across the world because more police officers were getting hired, and it was good news for some journalists who got great stories, great photos, great video footage out of it. For some, it will be the high point of their professional career. It was good news for construction workers in New York who were building the replacement building. So you can't say that that was an all bad news story. Most people would prefer that it not have happened. But once that news has happened, it's going to have some positive and some negatives for people.